This is a Chronicle podcast, bringing you ideas in the service of medicine.
From the Chronicle podcast system, this is a Skin Spectrum podcast. It's Yadav on Acne, with Dr. Geeta Yadav. Based on recent publications from the clinical literature, Dr. Yadav provides brief synopses of recent significant clinical developments in acne research, and provides her observations and comments to accompany each report. In each episode, Dr. Yadav will answer questions and offer her expert observations and anecdotes on treating this disease. If you have a question for Dr. Yadav or want to be in touch at any time, just send an email to yadav@chronicle.org. That's YADAV@chronicle.org. And, if you attach a voice clip, we might even use your question on an upcoming episode. Support for this podcast comes from Cipher Pharmaceuticals. Cipher is a specialty pharmaceutical company with a robust and diversified portfolio of commercial and early to late stage products. Cipher currently markets dermatology products directly in Canada and indirectly through partners in Canada, the US, and South America. Visit them at cipherpharma.com. And now, here's John Evans.
Thanks, Leona. Welcome to the second episode of Season 2 of the Yadav on Acne podcast with Dr. Geeta Yadav. I'm John Evans, Senior Editor at the Chronicle of Skin and Allergy. In this episode, Dr. Yadav will talk about research into the patient experience of acne. Our first study, from the March issue of Acta Dermatovenerologica, surveyed roughly 1,000 adolescents and young adults in France with truncal acne. Almost 40% reported truncal acne heavily or very heavily impacted their quality of life. Welcome, Dr. Yadav. What has been your experience of the impact of truncal acne on patients?
Thank you so much, John. The story on truncal acne is increasingly being told. We've got some specific products on the market now that have the indication for truncal acne, and I think increasingly the importance of truncal acne has been identified in the literature, including this paper. So this study assessed the self-reported impact of truncal acne on adolescents and young adults, sort of an internet survey done in France. And really, in terms of patient perception, truncal acne heavily or very heavily impacted quality of life in more than a third of participants, and that it impacted females more significantly than males. And this is actually something that I think speaks to the heart of how a clinician defines severe acne when assessing a patient. And sometimes one might think of truncal as by definition being severe because the location can be hard to treat with topicals. On the other hand, even if it's mild in terms of its clinical appearance, it may be severe from the patient's perspective because of the amount of psychosocial impact that acne has. And I think this study really kind of brings that home for me.
Our next study looks at work by Dr. Andrea L. Zenglein and her colleagues examining the impact of lidose-isotretinoin taken without food on the quality of life of patients with severe recalcitrant nodular acne. They found the treatment significantly improved quality of life starting at week 4. What's your take on the impact of systemic treatment can have on the quality of life in patients with severe treatment-resistant acne, Dr. Yadav?
Yeah, John, this topic of the impact of food is something that I think we've been increasingly discussing over the last couple of years, because now we do have a few options available to us where isotretinoin can be taken without food. And that sort of really liberates, I think, patients to be able to take this medication more reliably, to be able to increase patient compliance, and also to lead to better patient outcomes and longer term remission, so to speak, as we discussed in our last podcast together. In this case, this study sort of shows that twice daily lidose-isotretinoin can be taken without food for 20 weeks, and that'll improve the patient's quality of life and by extension, likely their acne. And so this isn't an efficacy study from lesion count point of view, but it does look at, as a primary endpoint, the acne specific quality of life questionnaire to assess patients' quality of life. And they correlate that with investigator global assessments for acne severity. So this is sort of in keeping with the idea to kind of dispel any myths there might be that this medication should be taken with food to get a high absorption, high efficacy, and high patient satisfaction.
Our last study today is from the Journal of Clinical Medicine in May. The researchers assessed the impact of pyruvic acid peeling on the quality of life of 200 patients with mild to moderate acne. They found the peels significantly decreased the severity of the acne and improved the quality of life of the patients. Dr. Yadav, what are your thoughts on chemical peels for acne and how they may improve patient quality of life?
There are definitely a variety of chemical peels that I use in my clinical practice to both treat acne and also some of the sequelae of acne, including scarring and hyperpigmentation. In this study, 35% pyruvic acid was used for lesions on the body, and it included 4 series repeated at 7-day intervals. 4 series of peels repeated at 7-day intervals. And there were no significant differences between the severity of acne and the lifestyles of subjects. And the applied cosmetic procedure did decrease the severity of acne and improve the quality of life of patients. I can see this in my own practice. There are so many different ways to treat acne, and certainly patients have a different appetite for prescription medications, oral medications. Sometimes their preference is for something like a chemical peel. It just depends on their perspective and attitude towards their acne. And it's nice to have an entire armamentarium of options for those patients so that they can achieve satisfaction in their treatment and that can work well into their lifestyle. I think what I'll add to that is, in terms of as an adjuvant therapy, I do find chemical peels can also be helpful. So it may not be in isolation. This study just looked at it in isolation, but you could also add that into prescription treatments. And so I think pyruvic acid is something that we don't use every day. I might be more common to use glycolic acid or salicylic acid or combinations thereof in my own clinical practice. So it is nice to see some of these additional options being available and being effective for patients with truncal acne. To get another perspective on today's topic, I reached out to Dr. Sonia Abdullah. Dr. Abdullah is a Toronto-based dermatologist in practice at Dermatology on Bloor. She's a specialist in injectable and laser treatments and is a well-known expert in treating acne. Dr. Abdullah, what have been your observations on how treating the cosmetic sequelae of acne can impact patient experience?
So when we're looking at acne, this is a medical condition that has aesthetic implications for patients. And looking at the sequelae, we really lump them into 2 different categories: the discoloration, whether it's hyperpigmentation or erythema, and the textural change, whether it is atrophic scarring, hypertrophic scarring, or keloidal scarring. Treating these things for patients is highly impactful. When we're looking at discoloration, keep in mind that macular erythema related to acne is still a form of inflammation. And many of these patients respond very well with things like photoprotection and topical retinoid use over a series of months. Hyperpigmentation, more common in patients with darker phototypes. And again, skincare will be one of the primary backbone things that we can do to improve patients' quality of life, because those markers of discoloration, again, constant reminder of the inflammation that was previously there. When looking at acne scarring, so true textural change, keep in mind things like keloids and hypertrophic scars, not only from a look perspective can be impactful for patients, but also from a feel perspective. So taking down the pruritus that's associated with them, again, is very meaningful to patients. When we're looking at atrophic scars, this is where we have to really engage in a therapeutic alliance with patients and help them understand that it's going to be a journey. And when we go on that journey, it may include pit stops. You might take a U-turn, you might have to take a break, but getting an understanding that there is an endpoint, again, will be really meaningful to patients, and just helping them recognize that we will be able to make improvement, but not necessarily resolution of those textural changes. Again, important for best outcomes for patients.
We turn now to a segment where we discuss acne myths and trends that are prevalent on social media. The first comes from Applesauce House on Reddit. This person recommends making a paste from water and crushed aspirin tablets to use as a spot treatment for acne. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Yadav?
Some of the more well-known ingredients used to treat acne in over-the-counter formulations include salicylic acid and benzoyl peroxide. Now, aspirin is primarily thought of as a pain reliever, but it also does contain acetylsalicylic acid. Now, while this ingredient is related to salicylic acid, it isn't exactly the same thing. Salicylic acid has drying effects that can get rid of excess oil, dead skin cells, and it's a well-known topical that's, again, used in over-the-counter acne treatment options. Using crushed up aspirin as a paste to treat acne is something that I've heard of people doing as an at-home remedy. If you do leave this kind of medication on the skin, it can be actually quite irritating and drying to the skin, and it can sort of increase the risk of peeling and dermatitis. So again, my recommendation is always to go with well-formulated products that have been tried and tested, but this may be an option for patients who are looking for an at-home remedy. I would just sort of advise not to do it too often because, again, that may increase that risk of irritation.
Glenteus on TikTok says that a mix of aloe vera gel, honey, turmeric, and lemon juice applied to acne spots for 15 minutes and then rinsed off with clean water is an effective treatment for acne. What would you say to that suggestion?
It's always these sort of concoctions that make me wonder about how formulation kind of comes into play. And also the fact that not all topical agents are meant to be leave-on. Some of them are better washed off. It also depends on the medium in which they're delivered. So, you can again kind of see the logic of aloe vera gel, which can be soothing, or honey that is a wound care agent, and even turmeric, which can be anti-infective. I really do think that lemon juice can potentially cause a lot of irritation on facial skin and acne spots. And that's where I think my biggest concern would come in. It's quite an acidic citric acid and can be quite irritating left on the skin. In this TikTok, the idea is to rinse it off with water. But again, I would go back to some of the more traditional formulations that you see over the counter. They are quite effective and beneficial. And I don't really see the value in using these ingredients that are probably, most of them better left as food than for skincare.
Earlier this year, you spoke with news outlet Birdie about a trend on TikTok advocating cold showers to reduce sebum production and thereby reduce breakouts. Can you speak to that trend and any science behind it?
So there's a little bit of logic in terms of the basic claims that cold showers can treat acne by reducing oil production. Part of it is because the oil doesn't flow through pores as easily when it's cold, and cold water can reduce some of the inflammatory effects of acne, which is where a lot of the discomfort comes from. Not to mention that cleansing your face with cold water can often be preferable to sort of scalding hot water, which can, strip your skins of some of their natural oils. But, in terms of whether or not cold showers can have a sustainable or durable effect on acne, well, that it's not so simple. I would say, cool temperatures are really important to kind of restrict some of those blood vessels and reduce swelling. But if you do have acne-prone skin, then you probably require an effective skincare routine that's going to support that. And that'll involve using a cleanser, maybe with an active agent that's anti-inflammatory, maybe something like benzoyl peroxide, and then switching over to any skincare products, leave-on, sort of a topical retinoid or retinol, or something that might even contain salicylic acid, or prescription products if you see a board-certified dermatologist. And that'll all sort of help towards minimizing those kinds of acne breakouts.
Thank you, Dr. Yadav. Listeners, if you have comments or questions for Dr. Yadav, send them over. Send an email to health@chronicle.org. Add a voice clip attachment to your questions, and you might appear in a future episode of this podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your colleagues. You can subscribe at Apple iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is produced in cooperation with Cipher Pharmaceuticals Incorporated. I'm John Evans, Senior Editor at Chronicle Companies. Your host has been Dr. Geeta Yadav, Founder and Director of Facet Dermatology in Toronto, and a general, medical, and cosmetic dermatologist. We'll talk again next time.